The director handed 6 dying Navy SEALs to a quiet nurse he had spent months trying to humiliate, then stepped back to watch her fail. A hurricane had killed the power. The surgeons were trapped behind sealed emergency doors. The helicopters could not fly. And Russell Dane smirking in front of the entire ER staff told Audrey Lennox that if she knew so much about mass casualty response, now was her chance to prove it. But in the next 58 minutes, Audrey would save 6 lives, destroy 1 career, and force an entire hospital to face the truth about the woman they had laughed at for years. Because the real question was not whether Audrey could do it. It was what she had been hiding and why. If you've ever felt underestimated at work or watched someone get dismissed before they even had a chance, this story is for you. Stick around and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The Northhaven Naval Medical Center sat on the edge of Cape Meridian, close enough to the Atlantic that on quiet nights the staff could hear the water moving beyond the base perimeter. It was not a glamorous posting. The hallways were older than most of the residents. The equipment was functional rather than modern, and the cases that came through were rarely the kind that ended up in training manuals. Audrey Lennox had worked the night shift there for 3 years. She was known for 3 things. She arrived before her shift started, not 5 minutes early, but 30, sometimes 45, walking the ward before handoff, to check what the previous team had left unfinished. She never panicked, not visibly, not even during the worst nights, when 2 or 3 critical patients arrived at the same time and the charge desk dissolved into noise. And she submitted reports, detailed, documented, methodical reports about every gap she found in the hospital's emergency response systems. She had flagged the blood reserve storage twice. She had written a formal memo about the backup generator in the old surgical wing, which had been listed as under review for 11 months, without anyone reviewing it. She had requested 3 separate times that the staff conduct a live mass casualty drill, because the last one had been 2 years ago, and half the current team hadn't been there for it. None of those reports had been acted on. Russell Dane, the facility director, did not read them as safety concerns. He read them as challenges. He was a man who measured competence by rank and title, and Audrey Lennox had neither. She was a night shift nurse who filed paperwork above her station and expected people to take it seriously. In front of the attending physicians, Dane had taken to calling her the nurse who thinks she runs the place. It landed as a joke every time. People laughed because it was easier than asking why exactly her concerns kept going unanswered. Dr. Colin Barrett did not laugh. He had worked alongside Audrey long enough to notice things that didn't add up. She read trauma imaging faster than most of the residents. She caught complications before the attending physicians did. She knew which instruments to prepare before the surgeon asked for them, not because she had been told, but because she had already worked through the procedure in her head and arrived at the same conclusion independently. Once during a difficult abdominal case, she had quietly redirected a resident who was about to make an error using exactly the right language with exactly the right understanding of what the error would cost. The resident had taken her correction without question. The attending had moved on without acknowledging it. Colin had asked her afterward where she had trained. Audrey had looked at him for a moment before answering. Somewhere we didn't have time to ask each other's titles. He hadn't pushed further. He told himself it was because she clearly didn't want to discuss it. The truth was that something in her answer made him feel as though the question itself had been slightly beside the point. What no one at Northhaven knew, what Audrey had never told anyone there was, that she had not always been a nurse. She had begun her career in military medicine as a corpsman, gone back to school while still in uniform, completed her medical degree, and spent nearly a decade as a trauma surgeon, embedded with special operations units. She had operated in places where the nearest hospital was a continent away, in conditions where the surgery happened on the floor of a building that was still taking fire with instruments she had sterilized herself. She had been a Navy commander. She had built the damage control surgery protocol that the hospital now used without knowing she had written it. After a mission that went wrong in ways she still could not talk about, without her hands tightening, she had submitted a voluntary suspension of her surgical privileges. She had a nursing license that predated her medical degree. She had earned it before she went to medical school, and she had quietly returned to it. She transferred to Northhaven, gave them her nursing credentials, and said nothing about the rest. She was not hiding because she wanted to deceive anyone. She was hiding because she had spent years believing that the people she failed to save mattered more than the ones she had brought home. Russell Dane thought she was a nurse who didn't know her place. He was about to find out what she actually was. The call came in at 11:47 on a Thursday night, during the worst storm to hit the Cape Meridian coast in 4 years. A rescue helicopter was inbound with 6 members of a Navy SEAL unit. The mission had been classified. What wasn't classified was the outcome. A hostage extraction had failed. The aircraft had taken fragmentation damage from an explosion near the extraction point, and the pilot had been forced to put the helicopter down on the water's edge rather than risk losing it entirely. All 6 men aboard were alive when they landed. The margin on that was thin and getting thinner. The first report over the radio gave Audrey enough to start building a picture before the helicopter touched down. By the time the doors opened, she had already moved supplies, repositioned the crash cart, and pulled the trauma team into a briefing that lasted 90 seconds because 90 seconds was all they had. The 6 patients came in fast. Reed Callahan, the unit commander, had a fragment of metal lodged in his abdomen. The imaging suggested liver involvement and internal bleeding. His pressure was dropping in a pattern that left very little time. Travis Boone had a neck injury. The swelling was closing his airway. He was breathing in short, labored pulls that were getting shorter. Miles Hanley was in respiratory failure. His chest on one side was not moving. Tension pneumothorax, air trapped in the chest cavity, compressing the lung, pushing the heart out of position. Without intervention, cardiac arrest was minutes away. Wyatt Kerr had a severed femoral artery. A tourniquet had been applied in the field, but it had not held perfectly. He was losing blood faster than his body could compensate. Graham Larkin had signs of cardiac tamponade, blood filling the sac around his heart, squeezing it until it could no longer pump effectively. Jonas Reddick had a head injury. His pupils were unequal. One was sluggish, the other barely responded at all. 6 monitors, 6 sets of alarms, 6 windows closing simultaneously. Then the lights flickered. A lightning strike hit the main transformer on the base. The primary surgical wing lost power. The elevators locked. The group of attending surgeons who had been notified and were on their way from the residence building on the far side of the campus found themselves cut off. The access road between buildings had flooded and the water was rising. The backup generator for the old surgical wing, the one Audrey had flagged in writing 11 months ago, failed to cycle on. The storm made helicopter transport impossible. Every route off the base was blocked. Russell Dane arrived at the trauma bay entrance 12 minutes after the patients. He took in the scene: 6 critical patients, a power failure, no surgeons, a nursing staff doing everything they could to hold 6 people together with equipment that wasn't designed for what they were being asked to do. And then he did what men like Russell Dane do when a situation exposes their failures. He looked for someone else to blame. He found Audrey at the center of it, already directing the team, already running the triage that no one had assigned her to run. He walked to the edge of the bay, crossed his arms, and waited for a pause long enough to make his entrance felt. When it came, he used it. "You've been telling me for years that this hospital isn't ready for mass casualty response," he said. His voice was even, almost pleasant. 6 patients, That's your chance to show us what a nurse can do." A few of the residents exchanged glances. One of them, a second year, who had been there long enough to know Dane's patterns, looked away. 6 monitors kept alarming. Audrey didn't answer Dane immediately. She was looking at Travis Boone's throat. The swelling had progressed. He had maybe 3 minutes before his airway closed entirely. She turned to the charge nurse and issued 3 directives in sequence: open the auxiliary procedure rooms, pull the O-negative reserve from secondary storage, get the portable surgical light from supply closet 4, because the overheads in 2 of the rooms were running on battery backup and wouldn't last. Then she turned to Dane. "I need the auxiliary surgical wing unlocked. That wing hasn't been cleared for use. The generator in the primary wing is down. I reported that 11 months ago. Right now I need the auxiliary wing." Dane's expression didn't change. "If you perform any surgical procedure without current privileges, I will have you removed from this facility and your nursing license referred to the state board. You will be charged with practicing medicine without authorization." That's not a warning. That's what happens. Audrey looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked at Travis Boone. Travis's chest was barely moving. His lips had started to change color. She reached up, unclipped her ID badge from her scrub top, and set it on the edge of the supply cart without a word. She looked at Colin, who was standing 3 feet away, and had been very still for the last 30 seconds. "Don't look at my title," she said. "Look at the patients." She moved to Travis, called for the equipment she needed, and opened an emergency surgical airway with the kind of precision that doesn't come from reading about a procedure. It comes from having done it before in worse conditions, with worse equipment, with less light and more noise, and people dying nearby who couldn't wait. Travis Boone's chest rose. Air moved through the opening. His color began to return. Dane ordered the staff to stop. Nobody stopped. Audrey did not have time to perform 6 complete surgeries. She knew that going in. The goal was not to fix everything. The goal was to keep 6 people alive long enough for the surgical team to arrive and finish what she started. Damage control. Stop the bleeding. Open the airway. Release the pressure. Buy time measured in minutes, not hours. She split the trauma bay into 6 working stations and assigned every available body, residents, nurses, corpsmen, a respiratory tech who had never been inside a trauma bay running at this speed, to a specific patient with a specific task. Then she moved. Travis Boone was first because he was closest to gone. The emergency airway she had opened was holding, but the passage needed to be secured before the swelling progressed further and closed around the tube. She worked with both hands, calm in a way that had nothing to do with the situation being calm, and everything to do with having operated in places where calm was the only tool that never ran out. Colin stood across the table from her. He had assisted in hundreds of procedures. He knew what trained hands looked like. What he was watching did not look like a nurse working from memory. It looked like someone who had done this specific thing in specific conditions that had nothing to do with a hospital. When she finished securing the airway, Travis's oxygen saturation climbed back toward a viable range. She was already moving before the number stabilized. Miles Hanley was in room 2. His left lung had collapsed under the pressure of trapped air. The heart was shifting. On the monitor, his blood pressure was in freefall. Audrey identified the intercostal space by touch, called for the needle, and decompressed the chest in a single controlled motion. The sound of air releasing was immediate. The pressure dropped. Miles's heart, which had been beating in an increasingly compromised rhythm, began to find its way back. A second-year resident named Porter had been assigned to Miles and was managing to hold it together until the decompression, at which point the combination of the sound and the speed of what he'd just witnessed caused him to go very still in a way that was not helpful. Audrey glanced at him once. "You don't need to not be scared," she said. "You just need to do the next right thing." "What's the next right thing?" Porter looked at the monitor. "Keep the airway patent and watch for reaccumulation." "Then do that." He did. Wyatt Kerr was in room 3, and Wyatt Kerr was the one Dane chose to make a point about. The femoral artery was severed. The field tourniquet had slowed the bleeding, but not stopped it, and Wyatt had been losing blood since before the helicopter landed. His pressure was low enough that Dane, standing at the room entrance with 2 members of the administrative staff, announced to no one in particular that the patient had already lost too much blood to justify priority resources. "Triage exists for a reason," he said. "You focus on the ones you can save." Audrey did not look up from Wyatt's leg. "You don't get to turn a living person into a convenient number." She extended the wound, located the proximal end of the severed vessel, and placed a temporary vascular shunt, a bypass that would maintain blood flow to the leg, while the definitive repair waited for a vascular surgeon. It was not a permanent solution. It was not meant to be. It was meant to keep Wyatt Kerr's leg attached to a living body until someone with more time and better equipment could do the rest. When she moved on, Wyatt's pressure had stabilized enough to no longer be the most urgent thing in the room. Graham Larkin was in room 4, and Graham Larkin was the case that removed any remaining doubt from Colin's mind about who Audrey Lennox actually was. Cardiac tamponade. Blood had been accumulating in the pericardial sac, the fibrous membrane around the heart, since the fragment entered his chest. The heart can only be compressed so far before it stops pumping entirely. Graham was close to that point. His neck veins were distended. His pressure was dropping. His heart sounds were muffled in a way that told Audrey what the ultrasound would have confirmed if the ultrasound were available. She performed a pericardiocentesis, first a needle into the pericardial space to drain the immediate accumulation. When the fluid came out, Graham's rhythm improved, but the source was still there. She made a small incision into the pericardium, drained the remaining blood, and controlled the entry point of the wound well enough to hold until a cardiothoracic surgeon could address the fragment itself. Graham Larkin's heart beat on its own on the table. Colin, who had been moving between rooms to assist wherever hands were needed, stopped for 3 full seconds when he processed what he had just watched. A pericardial window. Done without imaging, without a perfusionist, without a cardiac team, without anything except the knowledge of where to cut and what to expect on the other side of the incision. This was not a nurse with good instincts. This was a surgeon who had made this exact decision before, under conditions that made tonight look controlled. Jonas Reddick presented the problem with no clean solution. There was no neurosurgeon in the building. The CT scanner was running on backup power that was growing less reliable by the minute. The clinical picture Audrey was working from was a physical exam and a mechanism of injury blunt force to the left temporal region, a deteriorating Glasgow score, and pupils that had been telling the same story for the past 20 minutes. She made a decision based on what she had. The blown pupil on the left indicated an epidural or subdural hematoma on that side, blood accumulating between the skull and the brain, pressing inward, increasing intracranial pressure with every passing minute. Without relief, Jonas Reddick would be brain dead before a neurosurgeon could reach him. She called for a hand drill. The room got very quiet. She placed Jonas on his side, identified the landmark on the temporal bone, and drilled a burr hole, a controlled opening in the skull, to allow the blood to decompress. It was not a definitive treatment. It was the difference between a patient with a head injury and a patient with irreversible brain damage. When the pressure released, Jonas's left pupil contracted slightly. Not fully, not all the way, but enough. Audrey pressed on. Reed Callahan was the 6th patient, and he was the worst. The fragment had entered through the abdominal wall, and based on the ultrasound, she had managed to run on battery power, had caused a significant hepatic laceration. The liver bleeds generously when it is damaged. Reed's abdomen was full of blood that his body could not replace fast enough. She opened him. The blood reserve was running low. She was operating with less light than she wanted, less assistance than she needed, and a patient whose pressure was responding to her interventions in small increments rather than the sustained recovery she was looking for. She packed the laceration, controlled the primary bleeding vessels, and was working through a systematic check of the abdominal cavity when Reed Callahan opened his eyes. It happened without warning. He had been unconscious since arrival. The anesthetic she was working with was not ideal given his hemodynamic status, and apparently it had not been enough. He looked up at her through the oxygen mask. His eyes focused. He recognized her voice before he recognized her face. Reed's mouth moved under the mask. The words came out fragmented, air-thin, barely audible over the noise of the room. "Commander Lennox." The resident holding the retractor looked up. Colin, standing at the instrument table, went still. "You're still alive," Reed said. It wasn't a question. It was the kind of statement that comes from a man who had filed away someone as lost and was now revising the record. Russell Dane had positioned himself near the room entrance. He had been composing a version of events in his head for the last 40 minutes, one in which his decision to assign Audrey to the patients was a calculated judgment call rather than a public humiliation that had backfired in the worst possible way. When he heard the word "commander," his composure shifted slightly. "What did he just call her?" he said. Nobody answered him directly. But Reed, still conscious in the way that badly injured people sometimes are not fully present, not fully gone, kept talking in the flat, factual cadence of a man giving a debrief. He told the room what he knew. He had worked with Audrey Lennox years earlier when she was still in uniform. Commander Audrey Lennox, U.S. Navy, trauma surgeon, forward surgical team lead attached to special operations. She had operated on members of his unit twice before, in locations he could not name, in circumstances that he described only as the kind where you don't ask someone's title because there isn't time, and it doesn't matter. She had built the damage control protocol, the 6-step system on the laminated card posted in the trauma bay, the one with the Navy medical attribution at the bottom that nobody had ever thought to look up. She had left the service after a mission called Kestrel. He didn't know all the details. What he knew was that she had refused to leave without getting her people out, that she had gotten 11 of them out, and that she had not been able to get the 12th. A young corpsman, someone she had trained. After Kestrel, she had stepped back from surgery. She had asked for the suspension herself. She had returned to nursing and disappeared into the civilian system, and Reed Callahan had assumed when her name stopped appearing in any database he could access that she was dead. He finished speaking and closed his eyes. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then Dane spoke. He didn't acknowledge what Reed had said about Audrey's record. He didn't acknowledge that the woman he had spent years dismissing had just kept 6 people alive with inadequate equipment during a power failure in a hurricane. What he did was look at the assembled staff, the residents, the nurses, the corpsmen, the respiratory tech who had been pressed into service and had held his position all night, and begin to construct his exit. Audrey had concealed a psychological history. She had performed surgery without current privileges. She had taken command of a medical response without authorization. She had withheld material information from her employer. If any of the 6 patients died, he said the liability would rest entirely with her. He said it clearly in front of witnesses, and then he took out his phone. What Dane understood within minutes of Reed Callahan's disclosure was that the security camera system had been recording all night. It had recorded him arriving at the trauma bay and making the assignment. It had recorded his tone, It had recorded him refusing to authorize the auxiliary surgical wing, refusing to release resources standing in the doorway of Wyatt Kerr's room, and declaring a living patient a poor use of effort. It had recorded him ordering the staff to stop, and the staff not stopping. He made 2 phone calls in the corridor outside the trauma bay. The first was to the facility's head of security. The second was to the hospital's legal department. By the time Audrey was finishing her work on Reed, a request had been submitted to wipe a specific segment of the security system's overnight recording. The request was framed as a routine data management action. The person who received it had worked at the facility long enough to know what it meant and not ask questions. Inside the trauma bay, Colin Barrett had been watching Dane's movements between the rooms. He had watched the phone calls. He had watched the expression on Dane's face shift from exposure to calculation, and he recognized the shift because he had seen it before, smaller versions of it, in administrative meetings, in hallway conversations, every time Audrey's reports landed on Dane's desk and were quietly buried. Colin had not intervened in any of those moments. He had told himself it wasn't his place, that the chain of command existed for reasons that Audrey was capable of fighting her own battles. What he had actually done was nothing, and he knew it, and he had known it for a long time. He walked to where Dane was standing, and said at a volume the nearby staff could hear that he would be providing a full account of the evening to the Naval Investigative Office, including the director's instructions at the time of patient arrival, his refusal to authorize emergency resources, and his attempt to use 6 critically injured service members as a mechanism for professionally humiliating a staff member he had a personal conflict with. Dane told him to be very careful. Colin said he had been careful for 2 years, and it had cost 6 people an additional 40 minutes of adequate care. But a witness statement wasn't footage. The administration, once the legal department got involved, began moving in the direction that administrations move when the alternative is liability toward distance, toward process, toward the version of events that created the least institutional exposure. Audrey was placed on administrative suspension pending review. She was informed that she was to have no further contact with any of the 6 patients. She was standing in the hallway outside Reed Callahan's room when the suspension was handed to her. All 6 patients were alive. None of them were stable. The monitor in Reed's room went flat at 1:14 in the morning. The secondary ultrasound, run by a resident who had been checking Reed's status every 15 minutes, caught it in addition to the hepatic laceration. A small fragment missed in the initial assessment because of its position had worked through the diaphragm and nicked a vessel near the pericardium. Blood was filling his chest cavity. His heart had lost its rhythm trying to pump against the accumulation. The resident called the code. The staff moved. But the staff was exhausted. The equipment in the room had been running on dwindling backup power, and the repair that Reed needed was not something any of them had done before. Audrey heard the alarm from the hallway. She stood at the window of Reed's room and looked in. She could see the monitor. She could see the resident's hands and the angle of his body and what he was doing, and she could see with the clarity of someone who had made these assessments hundreds of times what the outcome would be if the next decision was made by someone who had never made it before, and she could not move. Not because of Dane, not because of the suspension, because the man on the table looked for 3 seconds like someone else younger, smaller, a face she had carried for years, with the specific texture of guilt that comes from being the one who walked out. The corpseman from Kestrel, the 12th person. She had frozen then too. Just for a second. Just long enough. Dane appeared at the end of the corridor. He looked at the scene in Reed's room, looked at Audrey standing outside it, and said loud enough to be heard by the 2 nurses at the station nearby that this was precisely why individuals with undisclosed psychological instability should not be placed in positions of clinical authority. He said it was a shame, but the outcome here would be a direct consequence of decisions made earlier in the evening. He said it while a man was dying 12 feet away. Colin came around the corner at a run, took in the situation in 2 seconds, and walked directly to where Audrey was standing. He didn't say anything about the suspension. He didn't address Dane. He looked at Audrey and said quietly but clearly enough for the people nearby to hear, "She could lose her license. But if she walks away, he loses his life." The nurses at the station stood up. The resident who had been working on Reed stepped back from the door and held it open. Audrey looked at Reed Callahan through the glass. She thought about Kestrel. She thought about the corpsman. She thought about what it had cost her to stop, not the career, not the title, but the specific weight of every patient she had not been in the room for, in the years since, because she had decided that her grief was more dangerous than her skill. She thought about the fact that she had been wrong. She picked up the surgical kit from the crash cart and walked through the door. The chest cavity told her everything she needed to know in the first 30 seconds. The fragment had not moved far. It had shifted during the helicopter landing, or possibly during transport, and had come to rest against the inferior margin of the pericardium in a position that was doing damage at a rate the body could not sustain. The blood that had accumulated in the chest was measurable. Reed's heart was still beating, but it was beating poorly, compensating against a pressure load that was climbing with every minute. She called for the chest retractor, positioned Colin across from her, and talked him through what she needed him to hold, and when. In the same flat instructional tone she had used all night. The tone that was not calm because the situation warranted calm, but calm because panic had a cost, and she had learned a long time ago to stop paying it. The backup power in the room dropped twice. The overhead light flickered both times and came back. On the second flicker, the monitor running Reed's cardiac rhythm went dark for 4 seconds before returning. When it came back, the rhythm it was showing was worse. She kept working. The blood reserve was effectively gone. They were operating with auto-transfusion, recollecting and reinfusing Reed's own blood from the chest cavity, which was viable but had limits, and they were approaching them. The suction was running on a unit that had been cycling on and off all night. The instrument count was being tracked by a nurse named Walsh, who had not left the room in 2 hours and was doing it from memory because the paper log had gotten wet when a ceiling tile gave way from the water pressure outside. Dane's voice came from the corridor at some point during the second hour. Audrey could hear him through the door, telling someone, an administrator, possibly someone from legal, that the situation inside was out of control, that she had violated a direct administrative order, that whatever happened next was the result of a rogue employee acting outside her authority. She did not respond. She did not stop. When she located the vessel, she told Colin to hold position, and not move regardless of what the monitor did. He held. She placed the suture. The bleeding slowed. Then it stopped. She checked the pericardial margin, confirmed the fragment was isolated and no longer in contact with the cardiac tissue, and closed in layers. Reed's rhythm, which had been deteriorating for 20 minutes, began to organize itself on the monitor. Not cleanly, not immediately. But the erratic spiking settled into a pattern that had recognizable structure, and then the structure steadied, and then the number on the screen climbed to a range that meant the heart was doing what hearts are supposed to do. She stepped back from the table. Her hands were steady. She looked at Reed Callahan, unconscious and still, and said something to him that nobody else in the room heard clearly. Later, Walsh would say it sounded like she told him that one commander does not leave before the rest of the team. But Walsh would also say she might have imagined it because the room was loud, and she was tired, and sometimes you hear what a moment seems to call for, rather than what was actually said. 112 minutes after 6 Navy SEALs had been brought through the trauma bay entrance, all 6 of them were alive, At that moment, 3 vehicles pulled up to the facility entrance in the rain. Rear Admiral Marion Holt had not been scheduled to be at Cape Meridian that night. She had been redirected when the storm disabled communications at a neighboring installation, and her convoy was rerouted through the base. When she arrived and was briefed by a corpsman who had been in the trauma bay all night and did not edit what he told her, she walked directly to the surgical wing without stopping at the administrative offices. Dane met her in the corridor outside Reed's room. He had his version prepared. He delivered it efficiently, with the confidence of a man who had been managing narratives long enough to believe that the narrative was the reality. Holt listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked him one question. She asked him whether the base's backup generator maintenance logs were current. He said that was not directly relevant to the situation at hand. She told him to stand where he was and not go anywhere. The camera footage was gone, or most of it was. The segment covering the period from patient arrival through Audrey's suspension had been deleted from the primary server at 1:06 in the morning, 23 minutes after Dane's second phone call. What Dane had not known, because it was not listed in any facility documentation he had access to, was that the tactical vests worn by Special Operations personnel on active deployment included integrated audio recording systems designed to function continuously until manually disabled. The devices were built for mission documentation. They were water-resistant, impact-resistant, and powered by independent battery cells that had a minimum operational window of 18 hours. None of the 6 SEALs had disabled theirs before losing consciousness. The device on Reed Callahan's vest had recorded from the moment he was brought through the trauma bay entrance. It had recorded Dane's initial speech. It had recorded the refusal to authorize the auxiliary wing. It had recorded the comment about Wyatt Kerr being a poor use of resources. It had recorded the order for the staff to stand down, and the staff not standing down, and every instruction Audrey had given from patient 1 through patient 6. It had recorded Dane's corridor conversation with the legal department at 1:06, and the comment about psychological instability he had made while Reed was coding. Holt reviewed the audio in the facility conference room with 2 members of her staff and the base JAG officer. The review took 40 minutes. When it was finished, she walked back to the surgical wing, gathered the available staff in the corridor outside the recovery area, and read Audrey's service record aloud from the beginning. Commander Audrey Lennox, Medical Degree Uniformed Services University. Trauma Surgery Residency completed while on active duty. 11 years of forward surgical service attached to Special Operations units across 4 theaters. Author of the Damage Control Surgery Protocol currently in use at 14 naval medical facilities. Voluntary suspension of surgical privileges submitted 18 months after the Kestrel mission approved pending psychological evaluation and treatment. Standing authorization for reinstatement upon request. She had never requested it. Holt looked at Audrey when she finished reading and did not offer a formal statement. She said simply that the record had always been available to anyone who looked. The investigation that followed was not brief and it was not quiet, but its conclusions were not complicated. Russell Dane had falsified emergency drill completion reports for 2 consecutive years. He had received written notification from 3 separate staff members, Audrey's reports among them, about the generator failure in the old surgical wing, and had not acted on any of them. He had reduced the facility's blood reserve allocation below the recommended minimum to protect a budget line in a quarterly review. He had directed the deletion of security footage during an active patient emergency. He had attempted to obstruct a medical response and had used the resulting patient deterioration as a mechanism for institutional blame shifting. He was removed from his position before the week ended. The criminal referral came from the JAG office and covered evidence destruction and conduct endangering patient welfare. Colin Barrett submitted a voluntary written account to the investigating panel that did not minimize his own role. He stated clearly that he had observed ongoing conduct toward Audrey that was retaliatory in nature, that he had documentation of at least 4 instances in which her formal safety reports were dismissed without review, and that he had not reported any of it. He said he had told himself it wasn't his responsibility. He said he understood now that it had been. He found Audrey in the break room at 6 in the morning after the investigation team had taken her initial statement, and the last of the 6 patients had been transferred to stable recovery beds. He sat across from her and said he was sorry, not for a specific action or a specific omission, for 2 years of looking at what was in front of him and deciding it wasn't his problem. Audrey was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she had spent a long time believing that the people she couldn't save proved something about her, that the 12th person on Kestrel was evidence of a fundamental limit that made everything else she had done irrelevant. She said she had been wrong about that, not because the loss didn't matter, but because allowing it to take her out of the room hadn't protected anyone. It had just meant fewer hands available when the next emergency came. She said it without self-pity. She said it like someone who had finished working through something and arrived at the other side of it. All 6 patients recovered. Travis Boone was breathing on his own within 72 hours. Miles Hanley's lung function returned to baseline over the following 2 weeks. Wyatt Kerr retained his leg. The vascular repair was completed by a specialist who told him afterward that the temporary shunt had been placed with unusual precision for a field setting. Graham Larkin had no permanent cardiac damage. Jonas Reddick completed a full neurological recovery, which his neurosurgeon described at discharge as the kind of outcome that required both good intervention and good fortune, and he was not certain which had contributed more. Reed Callahan's recovery was the longest. He was in the hospital for 6 weeks. He was walking without assistance by the end of the 2nd month. 3 months after the storm, all 6 of them returned to Northhaven. They came in uniform on a Tuesday morning with no press and no ceremony arranged. They had not coordinated their arrival with the Public Affairs Office. They had not notified the administration. They had simply come back to the place where they had very nearly not survived and asked to speak to the person responsible for the fact that they had. Audrey was on the floor when they arrived. She was in her scrubs running through a new intake with a resident she was training. Someone came and found her and said there were 6 men in the lobby asking for her, and she walked down. She was still wearing her nursing badge. Reed looked at it for a moment when she came through the door. Then he looked at her. "We didn't make it because you outranked everyone in the room," he said. "We made it because when every person with authority took a step back, you were the one who stepped forward." He brought his hand up in a salute. The other 5 followed. Audrey stood in the lobby of Northhaven Naval Medical Center and looked at the 6 men she had kept alive through a hurricane and a power failure and a director who had wanted her to fail, and she brought her hand up and returned the salute. Precise, unhesitating. The way she had done it for 11 years before she decided she no longer deserved to. She accepted the reinstatement of her surgical credentials the following week. She did not leave nursing. She took over the trauma response training program at Northhaven, redesigned it from the ground up, and taught it herself to surgeons, to nurses, to residents, to coursemen, as a single integrated curriculum, because that was how the work actually happened, and everyone in the building needed to understand every part of it. She had one rule posted above the entrance to the training room. In the moment, a life is at stake. Responsibility matters more than title. The first mass casualty drill under the new protocol ran 6 weeks after she took over the program. Every station was staffed. Every team knew their assignment. The generator had been tested and certified. The blood reserve was at recommended levels. When the drill alarm sounded, the new staff looked to Audrey. She picked up the assignment board and asked without urgency how many patients they were working with. Nobody laughed. The whole floor moved. What stayed with people who knew this story was not the drama of the surgery or the fall of Russell Dane. It was something quieter than that. Audrey Lennox had been in that hospital for 3 years. She had filed the reports, flagged the risks, done the work, and been dismissed at every turn, not because she was wrong, but because she was inconvenient. And she had kept showing up anyway, not out of stubbornness, not to prove a point, because the work mattered more than the recognition, and she understood that even when no one around her did. Most of us will never face 6 critical patients in a blackout during a hurricane. But most of us know what it feels like to be underestimated, to have our concerns waved off, to watch the people with the loudest voices get credit for things they didn't build, while the people doing the actual work stay quiet and keep going. Audrey's story is a reminder that competence doesn't always announce itself, that the quietest person in the room is sometimes carrying the most, that trauma doesn't erase what someone is capable of, it just asks them to find a harder path back to it, and that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is exactly what she did in that moment: set down the badge, look at what's in front of them, and choose to act anyway. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one waiting about the people who showed up when it mattered and the systems that almost stopped them. We'd love to have you here for the next one.